Welcome everybody to the Equity Index launch 2024.
Maria's here. Hi, Maria.
Let's just give people a minute to filter in. Hi Maria, hi everyone. Hi Joe.
Hi there.
Welcome everyone.
Hi, Joe.
We had loads of registrations, over 140 registrations for this event, which we're absolutely delighted about. So we'll just give people a minute or two to filter in. Hello, Tom.
Sophie Crease. Hi, Sophie. Brilliant.
Amazing to see so many people interested in gender pay gap stats
Brilliant.
on a Tuesday morning.
Wednesday.
Ah.
Dirk.
Good job, I'm not the one on the data, isn't it?
Dirk's here. Hi, Dirk. Nice to see you all. Brilliant. Oh, Annie from English UK. Brilliant. Well, it's 10:02.
Yep, so people will still keep arriving. We'll keep an eye on the waiting room and let everybody in. But let's get started because we've got a lot to get through. So as I said, this is the Equity Index 2024 launch. We're in our second year of producing, collating all this really interesting data for you. We decided to do it because, as most of you know, the government mandates organisations with 250 employees or more to submit their gender pay gap stats every year, and it all gets collated into this big spreadsheet that is very difficult to make sense of for a lot of people. So we've developed a really powerful piece of software that takes the data, makes it really easy to understand. It can be filtered into sectors and all sorts of interesting ways so that you can see how any company that has to submit the data is ranked, and it helps you benchmark. Just let me give you a little bit of background about Lead 50/50. My name is Leanne Lineker. I'm the CEO. We have a fantastic team of people who are really passionate about making data simple and giving organisations and you, individuals, really straightforward solutions that help you balance your workplace and create inclusive cultures. It was born out of a passion for fairness and equality. And we are really excited to bring you two really useful tools that help you do that. Just quickly before I introduce Dr. Zara Nanu and Jago Brown, I'll explain quickly what the difference between the Equity Index and our EquityIQ software is, because I know you're all dying to know. Well, Equity Index benchmarks organisations' gender pay gap. So it takes that data that people have got to submit and it makes it really easy to understand. And it benchmarks organisations against their competitors or people in their regions. EquityIQ is a tool that we've developed to audit and certify workplace inclusion. So organisations sign up to the EquityIQ audit, and the result is a Lead 50/50 certification, which helps them showcase and make real progress on their efforts around workplace equity and inclusion. So if you do want to demonstrate your commitment to an inclusive workplace internally and externally, I really recommend that you get EquityIQ audit and certified. I'm going to hand you over now to Jago Brown, who's our head of product and data geek. I'm sure you won't mind me saying. And Dr. Zara Nanu, MBE, who has decades worth of experience on workplace inclusion and culture, and is also a pay equity expert. So Zara and Jago, do you want to take it away? Thank you.
Thank you so much, Leanne, for this wonderful introduction. Good morning, everyone. Lovely to have you here today. Just as a way of introducing me a little bit, you may be more familiar with the wider Lead 50/50 team. So my background is specifically in women's rights and equality and diversity, and I've spent the last 8 years specifically focusing on the gender pay gap. I started focusing on the gender pay gap when in 2015, the World Economic Forum released a report that said we are 217 years away from achieving parity between men and women. 217 years away. At the same time, the World Economic Forum was telling us that by 2030, most of the people in this call will be in self-driving cars. And most of the people in this call will be taken care of when it comes to health by some kind of health tech apps. NASA is telling us by 2030, we'll be actually waving people off to Mars. So we'll be in our self-driving cars, waving people flying off to Mars, still 200 years away from achieving parity between men and women. And I think that is something that neither of us wants to happen. We want to be closer to achieving parity between men and women. And that's why I'm excited to be part of a team that is looking at utilizing data and driving data and innovation forward to help close those gaps, both in terms of pay, but also wider participation in the labor force and labor economy. I got really excited last week because the World Economic Forum released its new report. So every year they release a report where they talk about how long it will take to close the gap, what's the gap due to. And the new report that was launched last week tells us we are 5 generations away still from achieving parity between men and women. And the progress that has been made globally in terms of closing the gender pay gap from last year until this year is 0.1%. So tiny, small little progress. We need to get better at that and improve our performance when it comes to the gender pay gap, so we can have a future of work and overall a future as a society where we have more parity between men and women. So the EquityIQ index has a big role to play in this because it is using data to help roadmap for change and also help us understand within our UK economy, where are companies in terms of their gender pay gap and how can we support them and how can we support each other and build a community around closing that gap faster. So if we can go to the next slide. I mean, the team decided to create it, and overall any solutions that go in the space of utilizing data to help close the gap are based on the fact that data does give us more insight around where particular gaps are, why the gaps are there, what can we do to narrow those gaps faster. There isn't really a one-size-fits-all when it comes to the gender pay gap. All industries have their own particular areas of concern. So for instance, for the tech sector, it's the attraction and retention of women. For for other sectors, it's women in leadership and overall kind of higher level economic participation. The report I've mentioned from the World Economic Forum also cites some data from LinkedIn that shows that women continue to be underrepresented in leadership roles. Only 31% of leaders on LinkedIn are women versus the 42% labor participation. So that's a kind of gender split between men and women. So there's a long way to go, and data can really put the spotlight on where solutions could be and how we can get that solution faster. And if we can go to the next one. So what I'm going to be focusing over the next few minutes is the role that is played by the UK gender pay gap legislation, the new transparency rules that are coming in all over the world when it comes to pay, when it comes to representation, when it comes to anything workforce, and how that transparency is fueling a lot of workforce trends and how people decide where they want to work and how they want to work. And also I'm going to touch on how rankings in general from global organizations like the World Benchmarking Alliance, Equileap, Just Capital are helping inform investors on where they want to put their money and how they want to grow certain industries. And a lot of these rankings take into account gender diversity and inclusion data, and that's why it's taking up more and more of a space on the global arena. So on here, let's talk a little bit about the gender pay gap regulations. Some of you may be familiar already. The gender pay gap regulations have come into effect in 2017, and they require large organizations with 250 people or more to report on their gender pay gap on an annual basis. Companies have to report on their mean and median gender pay gap, so kind of looking at the different averages that they have across the organization. They need to talk about the proportion of men and women in different quartiles, and quartiles are the distribution of people within an organization from the lowest paid employee to the highest paid employee, split into 4 groups. Then it also looks at bonus data and looks at proportion of men and women receiving bonuses. So currently, only companies with 250 people or more need to report on this. But what we're seeing on the Government Equalities Office portal, where companies report this data, is we have a trickling of companies that are smaller, that are more progressive growth ventures, growing companies that want to report on this data and want to be more progressive. And there's also commitment from different parties, and we'll see how it all goes on July 4th, to lower the threshold to less employees in different companies. I think the regions like Scotland are looking at lowering it to 50 employees or more, and in England we're looking at 100 employees or more. So there's still conversations around how do policymakers widen the spectrum of companies who need to report on this, so that we can get more data and more insights about progress in diversity and inclusion, and therefore are able to have a bigger impact on the gender pay gap. Reporting deadlines are March and April each year, and this is when we get the data, and then Jago works his magic in terms of helping us understand what is it actually telling us. Because you could look at all of those 11,000 companies and be like, well, this company has a high median pay gap, but a low bonus gap, and this other company has a low bonus gap, but actually the proportion of men and women who receive bonuses are different. So how do we make sense of that? Which one is more important? So that's how the gender pay gap legislation has an impact on this. In addition to the gender pay gap reporting requirements in the UK, there's a wider movement internationally, globally, to create more transparency in the workplace. So in the US, I think it's currently 1 in 4 employees covered by transparency legislation. So that means the employer needs to be transparent about pay, needs to be transparent about career progression, needs to be transparent about opportunities for growth. And when new roles come up in the organization, say I'm a project manager, and then my employer advertises a new project manager role, and they have to disclose the pay for that. If that pay isn't similar to my pay, I'm going to have some questions to the employer. And that's exactly what's happening in the US right now. The EU has passed through pay transparency legislation as well. They have until 2026 to trickle it down in all of their countries. But employers with 250 people or more are going to have to start reporting on their data in the same way that the UK does. Employees can go into their HR department or talk to their manager and request to see how they're paid compared to their other colleagues. And also for companies that have a gap that is higher than 5%, the governments of those countries will mandate that they do an audit and that they organize representation for the employee, so that they can see why the gap is there and ensure that it's not because of discrimination and because of some characteristic that actually shouldn't be penalized. When it comes to pay, shouldn't be a decisive factor when it comes to pay. So pay transparency and overall workforce transparency are here to stay. We have younger generations getting used to it, and we have policymakers pushing for it across different OECD countries like I said, already happening very much in the US, across the European Union. The UK government was running a pilot around pay transparency. They launched it a couple of years ago on International Women's Day on March 8th. We just found out last week that the government has actually scrapped it, and we just didn't know about it. But it's very much on the agenda for any political party when it comes to kind of the next few years. So the pay transparency and workforce transparency directives and policies are coming in, and we all want to make sure companies are ready for it and prepared to be more open and transparent about these things. In addition to this, like legislation and policy making aside, there's also a lot of organizations that are starting to look at data in the same way that we do through Equity Index and ranking companies in terms of their performance when it comes to gender equality. So these just a few examples. Equileap ranks companies specifically for investors. So it looks at large corporations and how they perform in terms of gender, assigning them a score. And then these scores are utilized by investors and large banks and venture capitalists and private equity to decide how they're going to allocate investment. And then there's also World Benchmarking Alliance. They look specifically at the currently at the food industry, but looking at branching out in other industries as well. And it offers a global ranking on different kind of characteristics when it comes to employment, when it comes to customers, when it comes to supply chain, but all of that with a gender lens. So it gives us a better understanding of where different companies rank more globally. So these ranks currently exist primarily for larger organizations. And this is why it's really exciting that with the equity index, we're able to look across different companies from 250 to however many employees and create those rankings based on their gender pay gap data. Now, when it comes to ESG reporting, there's a lot of requirements, and I'm not going to go into those, but there's requirements for enhanced transparency, risk mitigation. It gives companies a competitive advantage, and there's a lot of acronyms at the bottom. If you're a EU company or a US company or a UK-based company and are looking at having to report on these ESG requirements, just get in touch and we can have a conversation about what these requirements are and how they can impact your organization. Some companies are required to do these. Others just want to do this because they want to show how they are a progressive employer and why it's important for them and their workforce and the industry that they operate in. Workforce trends. There's a lot of workforce trends, and I've been I remember when in the UK we launched the UK gender pay gap reporting requirements, and the Young Women's Trust ran a survey amongst young women across the UK to see, is this data that's going to come up on the gender pay gap going to impact, one, women's interest in applying for jobs with certain companies that have high gender pay gaps, and two, young women's interest in purchasing services and products from companies that have a high gender pay gap. And inevitably, the numbers were speaking for us, in that young women were not interested in working for companies that have a high gender pay gap and would actually actively seek to avoid them, and young women would not want to buy services and products from companies with a high gender pay gap. It certainly impacted my purchasing trends. So when I want to buy something, I sometimes turn to the Government Equalities Office website to see what the gender pay gap for that organization is, particularly if it's in retail and I'm looking for clothing and or in in the beauty market. I usually turn to the equity index and the gender pay gap reports, because they are industries that are largely focused on women as buyers, and I want to make sure that the organization who sell to women actually have equality and equity at the heart of everything that they do. When it comes to workforce trends, I mean, we hear these reports a lot. Organizations that are more diverse are perform better in the market. They have more competitive advantage. They're more innovative, and of course, I mean, these are all in a way, no-brainers. If you have more diverse people around the table, you're more likely to have represent the views of very diverse people and kind of be more inclusive in the products you develop, in the services that you develop. So when it comes to diversity and inclusion and a kind of narrow gender pay gap, the data is already there. Higher employee engagement, higher retention, better performance, increased productivity. All of these are demonstrated and proven outcomes for organizations that have better diversity. So it's just about kind of understanding that we can embed them in, and we can start looking at the equity index and how the companies that are top performers on the equity index have that higher productivity, higher performance, higher return on investment. There are a few, so this year, the gender pay gap report, actually, when the deadline passed in March, there was a flurry of news around how, for the first time since gender pay gap reporting, we're able to see some progress. That's great. I think we have to take it with a pinch of salt because we've had the pandemic in the middle of it, and in the pandemic, not a lot of companies reported, so they're kind of skewing the data and progress of data, but ultimately, we had this kind of little bit of good news. We're going in the right direction. The gender pay gap is narrowing, little by little, but still narrowing. A few sectors have stayed kind of as in the spotlight for not narrowing the gap fast enough and actually not performing as we would expect. And some of them were not a surprise to anyone. The construction sector, the finance and insurance, these are always the industries with the biggest gap. I think the biggest surprise for everyone was the education sector, because we know it's so much female dominated overall as a sector. It's never in the spotlight. It's never kind of one that people talk about when it comes to the gender pay gap, because we also think about, this is just about, like, just as a reminder, this is just about the gender pay gap. So when it comes to pay, schools in theory have a very robust kind of pay ranges system that they use, and it's very much similar across a lot of institutions. Whereas this time around, the education sector really came under the spotlight, and it would be great to see how we can engage more with the sector, because it's one that should be exemplary to everyone else. It should be a model for how everyone else in the society should do gender pay gap and should do gender equality, because this is the sector that has most impact on the younger generation. And we want to make sure that that younger generation is inspired and really understands equality and sees equality when they are in their respective educational institutions. So these are just some of the kind of the news spotlights that were coming out when the gender pay gap reporting deadline passed this year. So the equity index is here, like I said at the beginning, to give us a roadmap. It doesn't necessarily help us understand where exactly in a particular industry or in a particular organization the issues are. A more in-depth, more detailed analysis and audit is needed for that. But it gives us a kind of an understanding of where things are in the UK economy. With the 11,000 companies reporting on the gender pay gap, all of that data is so dispersed. And like I said, some of them have a higher median pay gap. Some of them have a higher bonus pay gap. Some of them have an equal distribution across the quartile of their workforce. And they have both men and women in leadership roles and men and women in lower paid roles. So how do we make sense of that? We have the equity index to help us understand, what does that mean? Where should we pay more attention, and how do we rank these companies in terms of their gender pay gap reports? It's very unique. I've been very excited since the day it was launched a few years ago, and I'm going to pass us over to Jago so he can take us through the index in a little bit more detail. But before I do that, like Ella said at the beginning, it's actually his birthday today. So if you want to embarrass him and put messages in the comments about his birthday, I'm sure he'd love us for it.
Thanks very much. Yes. Yes, obviously this is my favorite thing to do on my birthday. it's my 50th today, so I am looking forward to talking to all of you about gender pay gaps. So thanks, Zara. I wanted to take you through a few of the things from this year's data. There's a lot of data, so I'm just going to pick out a few things that I think are interesting trends. But before this, I just want to talk about how we get there and what we do, and a bit more about why we did it. This is what you're looking at now, is how the gender pay gap data comes out if you download it, if you want to get it from the government gender pay gap website. So there's about 11,000-ish companies that will submit this. They don't just submit one number, as Zara has been talking about. They submit about 14 data points. And so a few years ago, when we started looking at this, we were excited by the opportunity of creating something that was more a little bit clearer. We felt that this was quite confusing. It's not clear really who is performing and where the performances are, because there's lots of data, but also it's not clear what is good. And so we tried to create something that would show what's a good performance, and then allow people to get into the data and understand how sectors are doing, how types of organizations are doing, and how particular organizations are doing. If you move on, Ella, we created a methodology. And just to very quickly take you through that, there's a mean gender pay gap, there's a median gender pay gap, there's a mean and median bonus gaps, there's how bonuses are distributed through an organization, then there's the quarters of pay. So the upper, how many men and what percentage of the organization are in each of the 4 quarters of pay. So there's a lot of data there, and I think often we're talking about one number when we talk about the gender pay gap, and actually it's much more complex and there's more to look at than that. So this is why we created a methodology to rank that. So if you go to next slide, well, once we've done our ranking, it's a little bit more organized. This is roughly what it looks like if you were to look at it on a spreadsheet. But obviously we wanted to go a little bit further. So we created a website. So if you move to the next one, Ella. The website looks like this. So we show it in a B-swarm format. So basically that big red section in the middle is every single company that submitted gender pay gap data. I'm going to comment on a little bit more to how many and what they do. You can scroll around that. You can select by the type of employer, the sector, the region, or the size of the employer there. And we highlight the best employers, the best scorers in all of these sections. We're not really about calling out people that are not scoring well, because there's lots of reasons why you may not score well. So if you move to the next one, this is just an example of what you'll see if you filter for a sector. So this is transport. So what we often like to do with particular sectors and industries is filter this down so you can see how that particular sector is performing against other sectors. So what you really want to see here is more a cluster of little red dots towards the right-hand side as you look at it. That would be better scoring than the left-hand side. And then for each organization, if you move on one more, we show all the data there, and you can compare, you can select which years you want to compare to other years. So for each organization, if you want to go into this detail, this is all on the website. It's all there to show you the different ranks and scores for each of the data points. So it's just to help you get an understanding of how each organization is performing. So there are limitations on this. So it's important to highlight them now. So if you move on to the next one, Ella, it's worth saying the data still can be confusing. There is still a lack of accountability because organisations are required to do this, but actually there's no mandatory process for finding or asking why people aren't submitting. Lots of people miss the deadline. You've actually, when you look at the data, we've just got to take the company's self-evaluation and self-reporting as correct, and we don't actually know whether it's correct or not. Sectors are hard to see because the sector information comes from Companies House, so it could be just the sector that an organisation registered 20, 30, 40 years ago when they registered with Companies House. And obviously we don't always know brand names because some companies have more than one organisational entity. And one of the other things to point out when you look at the data is that the calculations aren't always the same. So if you look at gaps that are in favour of men, the maximum you can get to is 100. The gaps in favour of women can be anything. So a lot of them are much higher. So it looks like some of the organisations have much bigger pay gaps towards women. That's actually just statistically not correct. It's a calculation that the Office of National Statistics use, and it's because it's always divided by the men's pay. What I wanted to then go into, so there's some sort of overarching things there. And obviously it's UK data only, this, for any of you that have joined from other countries or interested in other parts of the economy or the world. This is just UK companies. So what we tried to do is look at interesting data points. So if you look at the next slide, I've done a bit of work for this about when, how many organisations submit and when they submit and whether they're late, just to look at some patterns over the years. So if you look at the last 7 years of data here, there's an anomaly in 2020 where the government just stopped the need for reporting because COVID, due to the COVID outbreak. So there's not great data there and everyone just stopped reporting. But if you look now, 2024 looks to me very much like it's going to be the largest year. So we'll have the biggest group of data. Obviously the reporting deadline was 2 months ago, but there's still people reporting. So I've just caveated that. So the data you're seeing today that we're talking about may change over the course of the year because there's another few hundred people are likely to submit later. So if you go to the next one, I've had a quick look at some data on the submissions. So 426 so far this year submitted late. That was the number we reported when we did all of our calculations. But one thing we are interested in is the pattern of when people submit. So just to be clear about what the requirement is, there's a final reporting date of April the 6th, but actually you can report at any time in the year. And so what you're supposed to do is pick a date any time in the year, report on that date, and then you can put your information in. So really there should be companies submitting all the way through the year if they're focused on this. So it's a correlation we like to look at because if you look at the data here, nearly 3,500 submitted in the last 7 days. And nearly 8,000 submitted in the last month. So that's 76% of all companies submitted in the last month. I just had a quick look yesterday at last year's data. There's still organisations submitting, and 23 organisations have submitted more than a year late. So whilst we don't want to call out performance, because there are reasons why you would have a gender pay gap that will be societal, and we do want to call out people that don't submit. So I did another little bit of work on the next slide, because I think it's interesting, because one of the things we look at is whether it does seem to me that it matters if you care about this. So if you look at total submissions, the mean gaps are, the mean average gap is 12.45, the median average gap is 11.58. If you look at late submissions, they're around about that or above that. Late submissions in the last 7 days, around about or much higher in the mean gap. If you look at the first 90 days, you've got a much lower submission on average. And if you look at the submissions to date, or people have already submitted in the first 2 months of this year, you've got much lower numbers. So the first 180 there are down in the 9 points. So over a lot of data, that's quite a big swing. So it does appear that if you care about this, then you're likely to be looking at it. You're likely to be thinking about it all the time, and therefore you'll submit early, and therefore you're likely to have a lower gender pay gap in general. So if you go to the next slide, what we like to do every year is see whether there's a change in the trend of all the submissions. What you're seeing there in blue is pay gaps that are in favour of men. In green is 0 pay gaps, and then the lead 50-50 colour, the pink, is pay gaps that are in favour of women. So actually what we've been seeing for the last 7 years is virtually no change in that number, basically. So there's always the same. Now some of the companies and organisations will change over the years. So we'll have pay gap towards men or towards women, or get to 0. But in general, the pattern doesn't change very much over the course of 7 years since we started doing this. So that's mean. The next slide is median. So you'll notice there are more organisations are able to get to 0 here on the median pay gaps, but the pattern looks about the same all the time. So very little. The story really is very little changing in that how they're distributed. So the other thing we like to look at is the overall workforce. Now, one of the limitations is that we don't know the actual number of employees in any of these organisations. We have an indicator in the number of because they submit within bands, but that is also taken from Companies House and isn't submitted by the organisation itself. When you look at the overall workforce, where our estimate from our data is that those 11,000-ish companies make up about just under 18 million people work for those organisations. And as you can see, what is different from last year is that there's just over 500,000 more men in the workforce, according to this data, whereas last year's data, there were slightly more women. So that is a bit of a change. So if you look at the highest quarter of pay, 59% men and 41% women, the upper middle quarter, 54 to 46. So again, this is one of the things we try to be really clear about. This is not about equal pay. This is about, and all this data is based on average hourly pay of men and women. So it's corrected for part-time work. So it really is showing whether men and women are paid differently across organisations. So it does indicate that people in the highest quarters of pay, which would normally be higher earning roles or more senior positions, there's more men in those roles, and there's more women in the lower middle quarter and the lowest quarter of pay. So that is our sort of overall split of all the men and women in the workforce. So then, as well as looking at the overall picture, we look at some sectors to see whether there's trends that we can spot. So the first thing we do is we look at types of organisation in employees and just do some rankings on the best employees. So that's the top 15 organisations in the country with fewer than 1,000 employees, and you'll see there's a little bit of movement within them, but most of them have pretty low pay gaps there. The next one is the largest employees, so people with more than 20,000 employees. So this is one interesting thing that comes up. What you often see is large organizations that may be known for not paying particularly high wages in these categories, because again, just because they have smaller gender pay gaps doesn't mean that everyone gets paid well in organizations. So it really is about the equality throughout the organization rather than people are being paid well. So it's another thing to think about. So then there's hundreds of sectors and thousands of companies we can compare, and so that's why we've built the website, so that you could go in and do that yourself and look at the organizations and the sectors and the filters that are interesting to you. But there's a few here that we like to look at. So these are the all organizations B Swarm and the education B Swarm. So you'll see, just by looking at that, education, as Zara was speaking about, slightly surprisingly, I think to lots of people, is weighted down towards the bottom end of the index. So if you go to the next slide, you'll see the top performers in education. Just leave that there for a second. And then the next one is construction, I think. So similar pattern, not as many construction companies in the list. Again, not many at all in the upper region, so nothing really above 80 in the scoring and towards down low. So you'll see there the 15th best construction company in the UK. If you look at the very far side, the overall equity index ranking is ranked nearly 3,000th in the overall list. So the next one is residential care. So you'll see a clear weighting towards the upper scales here in residential care. So when you go to the list of the top 15 performers, you'll see there the 15th best in the UK is ranked number 246 in the UK. So you'll see there's a much higher weighting up towards that. So I think we're starting to build up a picture over the years of whether or not the reporting in itself is making changes, but also highlighting good performers and highlighting good sectors that are scoring really well across the board for gender pay gaps. So I think we were going to move to questions now. Oh yeah, there it is, the slide.
I've had a question that someone asked me previously and wanted to ask, which is, Jago, Leanne talked about the EquityIQ software that we have. What can companies do? Is that a tool that they could use in order to improve their index score? Because I think, some organizations obviously want to make a change. They want to improve their gender pay gap and their equity index score, but they don't know where to start. Mm-hmm. What would you recommend?
So I say being intentional and being interested in what it is that creates gender pay gaps is an important first step. So the EquityIQ gives a really good view of everything that's going on in the organization. My opinion, from looking at the data and speaking to lots of companies and working with them on the EquityIQ and reporting back to them, is that most people and most organizations aren't doing any of this deliberately. So a lot of it is societal. It's not an organization's fault often if they have gender pay gaps, because practices that are just normal for most people will have bias in them, and that's not intentional, but it is there. So that if you go through the EquityIQ process, it will pick up lots and lots of statistics and lots of indicators of where that bias might be present in the process or in the system, in the way you're recruiting, the way you're bringing people through organizations. And so we give lots of recommendations into how you can remove some of that bias, remove some of that process. And obviously, again, you're battling against societal norms. So yes, I think it helps enormously, but just by being intentional about it will start that process. Wanting to understand why the gaps exist is a really important step, which is why we don't call people out for bad results. We're always calling people in for good results, because it's not always an organization's fault, and usually not intentional. So EquityIQ really gives you all the data, and then our recommendations that are built from hundreds of bits of research from organizations all over the world. So yeah, I think it's a massive help if you want to try and move that dial.
And can I just quickly add to that, Ella, in that it's so important to ground any initiatives in the data piece, and the equity index is such a good first starting point around that. As Jago said, biases sometimes come in ways that we don't expect. Usually sometimes when I run events like this, I do a little exercise where I read 10 words, and they're words associated with the word sleep, but I don't say sleep. So I say like nap, doze, pillow, dream, like 10 words. Neither of them is the word sleep. And then I ask people to write down the words that they remember, and always half of them write down the word sleep, although I never say the word sleep. And it just highlights how our brains work by the power of association, and we associate certain words with other words and other actions. And the same thing happens at work. We associate certain characteristics with certain type of employees. We associate a leader with someone who is assertive, like will come in a certain way, in a very kind of more exhibiting more male dominated characteristics. And we associate a lot of support roles with traits that women would have in terms of active listening and empathy and skills like that. So overcoming that bias is difficult. I have a hard time overcoming that bias, and I have 20 years experience in this space and a PhD degree. So it's hard. But once you ground yourself in that data and you take that score as a first starting point, and you think, where from here, that starts being more tangible, and it kind of helps hold yourself and your organization to account. There's also the fact that we look at the national median and mean and the national averages, and some organization may think, we're all right compared to the national number. But once you actually drill down into your industry, you may find out that your organization is actually, doesn't have that great of a gender pay gap when it comes to your sector. So you may want to look at it, because comparing yourself to the national average may not be the right thing to do.
Thanks both. That was really interesting, and I hope it answered the question from whoever sent it in there. We've got a question from Aisha in the chat. Aisha says, interesting facts. Thanks. You're very welcome, Aisha. Be interesting to know which organisation you are here to represent. But Alicia's asked how to initiate this conversation in her organisation. Is there a tool available for self-assessment? Now, the equity index is a great starting point. Aisha, you can go on, and if your organisation has over 250 employees, you can search there and see how you are doing. We produce competitor reports, which is a really useful analytical report, identifying the competitors of your organization and how you're benchmarked against them. But if you want to really take a look at how your organization is performing, then it's EquityIQ, and we're more than happy to jump on a call after this if you want to get in touch and arrange an appointment, and we can go in a much deeper dive into a demonstration on how the platform works.
Yeah, Leanne, you're absolutely right. A competitor report or this score within the particular industry could be a great starting point in engaging leadership in this conversation, because it can show your colleagues where the business is compared to anyone else you're competing with in the market.
So if anybody here works in an organization that has, sorry, Jago.
Can I just add something, just a quick thing about how to do it?
Yes.
I think two common factors for me in all the people that are the organizations going through and being successful through EquityIQ is they take the blame out of the conversation really early, so that people are in like senior positions all the way through the organization aren't feeling like challenged or blamed for it, and they're curious. They're curious about the results, curious about what might happen if they do something about it. So I'd say from a how to approach it, those are two really important things.
Absolutely. And if an organisation doesn't have 250 employees, they don't have to report their gender pay gap stats. We can still do that calculation for you and benchmark you as well in the equity index. So if you're if you do work with a smaller organisation and you're interested in finding out how you would benchmark, then we can do that piece of work for you.
Brilliant. Well, thank you very much. We're coming to the end of the presentation. Oh, I did actually have one question earlier. Jago, how does this work help retain staff? I think that's a big issue, especially in education. We were reading an article the other day, weren't we, Zara, about multi-academy trusts, how they are struggling with retaining staff or attracting top talent. What can organizations do in that area with relation to EquityIQ or their data gender pay gap? Jago, would you have any recommendations?
For recruiting, so retaining staff. So I suppose one thing that really stands out to me is when we go through the process and ask organizations about what's in place, lots of people have formal recruitment policies. They have formal recruitment processes. So very focused often on bringing people into organizations. And yes, there might still be bias in it, but there's a process and there's intention there. Very few then have formal processes for cultivating people's careers in organizations. So actually this is the bit where the bias is much more prevalent, and so people are less able to then bring people through organization. So obviously naturally that will start to diminish your talent, because if you're not bringing people through or not cultivating their careers in a way that they're able to give the best to the organization, then you will start to lose people, or you'll keep the people and lose their intention and their focus and their abilities and their flow. So I think the first place to start is how guided and how formal and how clear the internal process is for that. And the second thing I think is the lack of data is always obvious around how much time, effort, and money is spent on people's development and personal development and skills and training, often ad hoc, and often left to people that get specifically mentored or pulled through the process, which is why we suggest sponsorship rather than mentoring or coaching, because sponsorship is very intentional. It's senior people in an organization looking for and taking responsibility and bringing people up through the organization in a structured way, rather than I think mentorship often doesn't work, because statistically it works for the people in it, but it doesn't work for changing organization structures, because it's self-selecting. It's people that are inclined to do it end up through mentoring programs. So there are a number of things, but I think basically having a formal approaches to training and CPD and internal promotions and movements is definitely the big area that I see when I speak to organizations.
Zara, would you have anything to add to that about retaining staff or attracting?
Yeah, I mean, it's an interesting one, because as I said before, it was really surprising to see the educational sector really spotlighted in this year's reporting. And then I looked more into it, and it turns out we're seeing teacher vacancies double in the last 3 years and continue to grow, particularly so for multi-academy trusts, where the attrition rate is currently at 20%, much higher than the average public sector and the average local council schools. So it's clearly the transformation that comes with building a multi-academy trust clearly is having an impact on the gender pay gap. It's kind of an accumulation of schools that are trying to kind of mainstream their policies, their processes, and somewhere along the way, things are falling through the cracks, and having access to an opportunity to audit and streamline all of that, I think is clearly that would help address this issue and help address that skyrocketing attrition rate of staff.
Brilliant. All right, well, thank you very much. You know, if anyone here is listening, wants some more information, Aisha, I know you've put a comment in the chat. If you want to reach out to me on LinkedIn, I'm happy to hop on a Zoom and have a chat with you about how maybe we can help. Or if you have any other questions, connect with us on LinkedIn. And yeah, well, thank you all very much for joining us.
Thanks,
everyone. Enjoy the rest of your day.
Thank you.
Thank you. Bye, Angela. Bye, Sumay. Thank you, Aisha.
All right.
Birthday, Jago.
Happy birthday, Jago.
Thanks, Tom.